mommies, let's talk about some common myths or misconceptions about treating the R sound. I'm Amy Graham, a speech language pathologist in Colorado, and I specialize in speech sound disorders. Okay, here are some common myths that I hear quite a bit. The first one is that kids with an R sound error do that error because of a weak tongue or a lazy tongue. Let's think about that though. If you have a child with a weakness, that's called dysarthria. And if there is indeed weakness of the tongue or weakness of any part of the articulators, then you would not likely see just a specific sound error. That child would have weakness or slurred speech or imprecise articulation on all the speech sounds, not just the R sound. So consider that. And really, if you're assuming weakness, my question would be, have you actually ever assessed for weakness? Have you done your oral neck exam? Have you had them protrude their tongue, move it side to side, move it up and down with opposing pressure to actually see if there is indeed weakness there? If you haven't done that, then we absolutely should not be assuming weakness. And really, if there is weakness there, we would probably also see some other speech subsystems impaired as well, like breath support, like vocal quality, like hypernasality, for example. So let's stop using that term, child can't produce the R sound because of weakness. That's likely not the issue. If it is just that single sound error, then it's probably mislearning. The child just has not learned the correct way or the precise way for producing a really efficient and crisp, clear R sound. Myth number 2, R sounds are caused by tongue ties. Okay, let's talk about this. I'm gonna get myself in trouble because people don't like us talking about tongue ties, but here's the thing. The research continues to not really show a causal link or even really a correlation between speech sound errors and lingual restrictions like ankyloglossia. So that is just something to really keep in mind. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be some children that may struggle with particular speech sounds because of restrictions. That completely makes sense. But to automatically assume that a child is struggling with the R sound because of a tongue tie, because of ankyloglossia, the research just does not necessarily back that up. So if it's only the R sound and they do have what is an obvious restriction, maybe they do have difficulty protruding their tongue, absolutely a thing, but can they say other sounds appropriately and accurately and efficiently without compensations? Like if you can do the K or the G sound, then you have posterior motility in your tongue appropriate for an R. If you can say E and you are anchoring the lateral borders of the tongue up against the molars, then you have that ability to produce that movement that we also need for the R sound. If you can say the T or the D or the L or the N sound with that tongue tip up at the alveolar ridge, then you have enough movement, range of movement to get that tongue tip up for the R sound. Which brings me to my next myth, that we either need to choose between a retroflexed R or teaching a bunched R. I know we kind of think about that dichotomy of, okay, either we're gonna teach that child to curl their tongue back to produce an R sound, or we're gonna teach them to pull their tongue back in a bunched way towards the posterior pharyngeal cavity in order to produce an accurate R. But Jonathan Preston and colleagues in 2020 showed us through imaging studies that actually there are 5 movements that we need to do to varying degrees, but that always have to happen in order for us to make a crisp, clear R sound. So here's what they are. The first one being, we need the front half of the tongue to be elevated to some degree. Now, to me, that kind of sounds like retroflexed, but even if you're doing a bunched R, you still have to elevate the front half of the tongue. So keep that in mind. We're gonna teach that for all of our kids. The next thing that always has to happen is we have to take the posterior portion of the tongue, the tongue root has to be retracted so that we get pharyngeal restriction. Now, that to me sounds like a bunched R, but that has to happen even if we're teaching a retroflexed R. So both movements have to happen. And if you're only focusing on one or the other of those movements, I think you're probably missing what most of my kids struggle with. And that is the tongue body has to be lowered because the sides of the tongue are being elevated and anchored up against the molars. And if you're not able to do that, then you will not get an efficient, accurate R sound. And the fifth thing that always has to happen is we actually need a little bit of lip rounding when we say the R sound, which brings me to my next myth, is that we should be teaching kids to smile when we're teaching them the R sound. Now, here's why we don't need to do that for our kids who are maybe a little bit older and not gliding the R sound, but more distorting the R sound. Because if we teach kids to smile, that's something that we do for our younger kids who are producing a W, instead of the R. So if we take a word like read, we're gonna teach them to smile, read, so that they don't make that W. That's fine for our younger kids. But for our older kids, if we're teaching them to smile, they're gonna sound like lead, because we're compensating with our lips for what our tongue is not doing. So we have to focus on all four aspects of what that tongue has to do: that pharyngeal restriction, elevating the front half, lowering the tongue body, and anchoring the sides of the tongue up against the molars. But we also need to lip round a little bit. So let's take that word read. Even though there's a retracted vowel, that E sound right after the R sound, we still are gonna round our lips a little bit when we say the R in that word. So do it with me as you're sitting there and watching me. Get ready to say the word read, but freeze before you say the word. Read. I'm rounding my lips. You probably are too. How many times? Oh, good. I think I'm at like 8.5 minutes.
Okay.
So I think we're good. I've got a few in. Okay. All right, next myth is we need to wait till kids are older, like around the age of 8, in order to start treating the R sound. Here's the thing. The average age of acquisition, according to McLeod and Crow in 2018 and Crow and McLeod in 2020, is 5 years old for the R sound. That means most kids, by the time you're approaching 6, are probably gonna be producing the R sound. And if we wait until a child is 8 years old, that is gonna give them many more years to habituate an incorrect production of that R, and it's just gonna be more difficult to remediate. So I would encourage you to start actually remediating that R sound a lot earlier. Another myth is we need to teach kids to say the R sounds all in the same way, in the same manner, using the same approach. Not true. Again, I kind of distinguish between gliding, that kid is using a W instead of R, versus a child who is distorting the R. Because if they're gliding, an approach like minimal pairs is great to teach them the difference between W and R. Weed and read. Those are two distinctly different sounds that they're substituting one for the other. So, great phonological approach for a phonological impairment. But if you have an older child who's not doing that, they're distorting the R. It sounds like lead, or maybe like a different kind of a distorted vowel. You just don't know quite how to transcribe it. That's an indication that it's a distortion, not a substitution. Those kids, older, these probably older, maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, maybe even older than that, maybe teenagers, we have to be very precise in how we're teaching those particular sounds. And we need to use motor learning principles, because now it's not a phonological issue. This is a motor issue. This is an articulation issue. And so when you're listening, those sounds have to be precise, which also leads me to my next myth, which is let's just practice those words if we get a closer approximation of that R sound. And we're gonna practice that in words, in phrases, and sentences, and let's just kind of cross our fingers that that R sound will clear up. That might be okay for your younger phonological based errors. It's probably not going to be great for your older kids who are distorting that R, because just practicing that errored sound, that maybe closer approximation, is just going to reinforce that incorrect production. So I would encourage you not to work on words or sentences or phrases unless and until that R is absolutely precise. Next myth. Oral motor exercises are needed to remediate the R sound. Here's the thing. We know in the literature that speech is a task-specific skill, meaning if we want to improve speech, we have to produce speech. So there is no evidence that producing different non-speech movements or exercises is going to directly influence or help that child produce any specific sound better. The evidence is just not there for it. So if you want to practice the R sound, if you want to improve the R sound, you have to practice the R sound. Last myth is you have an older child, a 16-year-old, and it's just too late. They won't ever be able to produce that R sound. You've missed your window. That is absolutely not true. And let me tell you a little story about what happened with me. I had a 5th grader that I was working with in the schools, and he hated speech therapy. He wasn't motivated. It didn't influence him or impact him socially or academically. And so I went ahead and spoke to parents, and we decided that we would stop speech because no practice was happening at home. He wasn't improving, and he was taking time out of class. So we just put it on hold for a little bit, but I told parents, hey, bring him back to me if he ever is motivated. What happened was, a few years later, he was 16 and he wanted to be in the school play. And now all of a sudden it was really important to him to correct that R sound because now it was bothering him socially and it was impacting his ability to participate in the activities that he wanted to participate in, like the school play. So he came to me, we worked on that for 2 months and he remediated his R sound. One, because again, he was older and I think things just made a little bit more sense to him as far as our cueing and our strategies go. And also he was really motivated to practice at home, which he did consistently. And so it is never too late to remediate an R sound, especially if you have somebody who is really motivated. I have helped adults remediate particular sound errors as well too. So those are some common myths that we have about treating the R sound. I hope some of these have been helpful to you. If you are struggling with any aspect of assessing for or treating the R sound, I have a 2-hour course all about how to remediate that R sound. Click on the link below. If you have any comments, drop them below.